For years, everything in his home looked calm from the outside. The lights, the cars, the steady routine of a man who had spent decades preaching strength, discipline, and divine covering. But inside those walls, something was happening that no one could see. He had been feeling strange sensations for months, sudden waves of dizziness that made him grip the edges of tables, moments where his heart raced without warning, and nights where the pain in his chest forced him to sit upright just to breathe. Still, he told no one. He pushed through every sermon, every meeting, every prayer line with a smile that hid the truth he refused to face. But one night, everything changed. It began with a faint sound, a thud so soft it could have been mistaken for something falling over. But his wife knew him too well. She recognized the silence that followed, the eerie quiet that didn't belong in their home. She called his name, expecting him to respond with a tired laugh. But there was nothing. She walked toward the study, her footsteps quickening as worry tightened in her chest. When she opened the door, what she saw sent a shock through her entire body. He was slumped over on the floor, one hand pressed against his chest, his breathing shallow and uneven, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. The man who had spent a lifetime calling others to faith was now fighting to stay conscious. She rushed to his side, trying to keep her voice calm as she held his hand, but he could barely speak. He whispered that he felt something snap, something he couldn't describe, a terrifying feeling that made him believe this might be the moment where everything ended. She dialed emergency services with trembling fingers, her voice shaking as she explained what was happening. Within minutes, paramedics filled the room, their expressions serious as they surrounded him. They asked questions he couldn't answer, checked vitals that made their faces tighten, and moved with the urgency of people who knew the situation was far more dangerous than it appeared. Neighbors peeked through windows, staff members received panic calls, rumors spread within minutes, and by the time he was lifted onto the stretcher and rushed into the ambulance, the truth was undeniable. Something was very wrong. That night didn't just scare his family, it shattered the illusion that he was invincible. It exposed the private battle he had tried to hide from everyone, even from himself. And it became the moment his entire inner circle would later describe as the night everything changed. He had always been the kind of man who pushed through everything: pain, exhaustion, long flights, back-to-back sermons, leadership meetings that stretched late into the night. Whenever someone urged him to slow down, he brushed it off with a chuckle and a wave of his hand, insisting that he was fine, that God had him covered, that rest could wait. But doctors had been warning him for years that something was wrong beneath the surface. Small warnings at first, elevated numbers, unusual fatigue, stress levels far beyond normal. They told him repeatedly that his schedule was destroying his health, that the constant pressure, the lack of sleep, and the emotional strain of carrying a global ministry on his shoulders could come back to hurt him in ways he wasn't prepared for. Still, he ignored it. He believed faith would carry him. He believed leadership demanded strength. And he believed admitting weakness would make him look like he wasn't the giant the world expected him to be. But warnings don't disappear just because someone refuses to hear them. Slowly, quietly, his body began to show signs he couldn't hide. Headaches that lasted all night, vision that blurred at the edges, tightness in his chest that came and went, like a shadow stalking him. His doctor urged him to come in for follow-ups. Tests were scheduled, but he canceled half of them, convinced he had too much to do and too many people depending on him. He kept pushing, kept preaching, kept traveling, even when he could barely catch his breath after walking up a short flight of stairs. And then, one afternoon, his doctor called with a tone he had never heard before, a tone that froze him where he stood. The doctor didn't sound calm. He didn't sound patient. He sounded worried. He told him straight the symptoms he had been ignoring were not signs of simple stress. They were signs of something far more serious, something that could escalate without warning, something that could take his life if he didn't act immediately. The words hit him like a blow. For the first time, fear pierced through the confidence he wore like armor. He sat down slowly, feeling the weight of years of overwork and denial crashing into him at once. The doctor pleaded with him, begged him to take this seriously, to come in, to stop pretending that faith and strength alone could hold off the consequences of pushing himself past every limit. That moment, that warning, was the beginning of everything that unfolded next. It was the message he wished he had listened to sooner, the message that haunted him, the message that explained the collapse that would shake his entire world. It was supposed to be one of the biggest Sundays of the year, the kind that filled the sanctuary to the doors, the kind where people lined up outside hours beforehand, the kind where his presence alone electrified the entire room. The choir was ready, the cameras were rolling, the energy was thick with expectation. Backstage, he paced slowly, trying to steady his breathing, brushing off the tightness in his chest as nothing more than nerves or fatigue. His assistant asked if he was okay, and he gave the same answer he always did, "I'm fine." But that day, he wasn't fine, not even close. Minutes before he was scheduled to walk on stage, he felt a sudden shift inside his body, a strange heaviness that made his knees weaken. He gripped the arm of a chair, took a deep breath, and told himself he just needed a moment. But the moment didn't help. The room started spinning, blurring at the edges. He tried to call for someone, but the words didn't come out. When the stage manager signaled him to step forward, he pushed with everything he had, refusing to let anyone see him break. He took 2 steps toward the curtain, and then everything went wrong. His body swayed, his eyes rolled, and he collapsed to his knees. A gasp rippled through the people closest to him. Security rushed in immediately, surrounding him in a tight circle as his hands shook uncontrollably. Someone shouted for water. Another yelled his name. One of the musicians dropped his instrument and ran backstage, his face draining of color. For years, the man everyone believed was unshakable now lay on the floor, struggling to stay conscious. The congregation had no idea what was happening. They saw the confusion, the whispered commands, the sudden halt in the service. The choir faltered mid-song. A cameraman lowered his lens. The worship leader paused, glancing nervously toward the side of the stage. Then word began to spread row by row. Something was wrong, something serious, something terrifying. Meanwhile, backstage, he fought to breathe as staff lifted him gently, trying to sit him upright. His pulse was racing far too fast. His skin was slick with a cold sweat. His vision kept fading in and out. And in those moments, between consciousness and darkness, he realized he had pushed himself far past the limit. The ministry he carried on his shoulders, the expectations he tried to meet, the pressure he embraced for decades, it had all finally caught up. He whispered, "I can't feel my arm," and fear exploded through the room. For the first time in his life, his team saw him not as a leader, not as a pastor, not as a giant, but as a human being whose body was begging for help. That collapse wasn't just an incident, it was the breaking point. A moment that revealed the truth he had been hiding, the truth he could no longer outrun. His family had been watching him fade long before the public saw anything unusual. They noticed the way his shoulders slumped when he walked through the door, how he lingered in the hallway as if gathering the strength to pretend everything was fine. They saw the weariness in his eyes, the heaviness in his steps, the way he sat at the dinner table, staring at his food without touching it. But he always insisted he was okay. Always said he just needed rest, always brushed off their worries with that same practiced smile. What they didn't know, what he never allowed himself to confess, was that he had been carrying a silent battle for years, a battle he didn't think he had the right to share, a battle he hid behind sermons about faith and strength. One evening, after the collapse, he gathered his family in the living room. The lights were low, the house unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your heart pound because you know something important is coming. He sat down slowly, his hands trembling, his breath unsteady, and when he finally lifted his head, his eyes were filled with a pain they had never seen before. He told them everything, not the polished version, not the brave version, not the half-truths he used to protect them, but the real story. The sleepless nights when his chest felt like it was tightening, the dizzy spells he hid by locking himself in his office, the moments he saw stars in his vision but pretended everything was normal, the overwhelming fear that maybe his body was failing him faster than he wanted to admit. He confessed that he didn't say anything because he didn't want to scare them, didn't want to burden them, didn't want them to see him as weak. He felt the weight of expectations, from the church, from the public, from himself, pressing down on him like a silent torment. He admitted he pushed past every warning sign, convinced that slowing down meant disappointing people who depended on him. His family listened in stunned silence, tears streaming down their faces as they realized how close they had come to losing him without ever knowing why. His wife held his hand as he spoke, her grip tight with heartbreak. His children wiped their tears, unable to believe he had suffered alone for so long. And when he finally finished, he broke, his voice cracking, his shoulders shaking, the dam of strength he had forced himself to maintain finally collapsing. They embraced him, not as a leader, not as a pastor, not as a public figure, but as the man they loved, a man who had nearly drowned in silence because he didn't want to worry them. It was that moment, that heartbreaking confession, that made them understand the depth of the tragedy he had been hiding and the fight he had been facing behind closed doors. The recording wasn't meant for the public, it wasn't meant for outsiders, critics, or even church members. It was a confidential leadership meeting held in a small conference room late in the evening, the kind of meeting where doors stayed locked, phones were turned off, and only the most trusted individuals were invited. They gathered around a long table, waiting for him to speak, expecting another routine update about ministry plans or finances. But when he walked into the room, they immediately sensed something different. His posture wasn't strong. His face wasn't composed. His eyes looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying a burden far too heavy for one person. He sat down slowly, placed both hands flat on the table, and closed his eyes as if gathering strength just to speak. When he finally began, his voice was low, shaky, and nothing like the confident tone they were used to hearing. He told them he had received news, medical news, that had shaken him more deeply than he wanted to admit. He confessed he had been ignoring symptoms for years, pushing through pain, hiding weakness, and pretending everything was fine because he felt responsible for being the strong one, the steady one, the leader who never faltered. As he spoke, a few members exchanged stunned glances. They had noticed changes in him, of course, but none of them imagined the truth was this serious. He admitted he had collapsed backstage. He admitted the doctors had warned him repeatedly. And then he said something that left the entire room frozen. "I'm scared." Those two words were so unexpected, so vulnerable, that the silence afterward felt heavy enough to crush the air. This was a man they had always seen as unshakable, a man who could preach for hours without losing breath, a man who seemed immune to stress, fear, or weakness. Hearing him confess such raw emotion was like watching a pillar crack in slow motion. One of the board members whispered his name, trying to comfort him, but he held up his hand and continued. He talked about the pressure of carrying thousands of people's expectations. He talked about the guilt he felt for failing to take care of himself. He talked about the fear of what might happen if he collapsed again and didn't get back up. Someone in the room recorded that meeting, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of losing their leader, fear of the truth being buried again, fear that if he didn't slow down, something irreversible would happen. When the audio leaked days later, the world heard a side of him they never imagined existed. They heard the trembling in his voice, the pauses between sentences, the weight of a man who had run out of strength. They heard honesty, vulnerability, and pain. Not the polished messages from the pulpit, but the confession of a man who had finally reached his limit. And that recording changed everything. It exposed the tragedy he had tried so hard to hide, and revealed the human heart beneath the pastor's robe. When he finally stepped up to speak, the entire atmosphere felt different, heavier, quieter, almost sacred. People expected strength, authority, the commanding voice they were used to hearing. But the man who appeared before them that day was not the unshakable leader they had followed for decades. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his hands trembled just enough to be noticeable. And when he took a breath, it sounded like it carried the weight of every sleepless night he had endured. He opened his mouth, tried to speak, but the first words barely came out. He paused, looked down, and for the first time, allowed the silence to expose what he had been hiding. And then, with a voice so soft it barely reached the back row, he finally told the truth he had fought to keep private. He confessed that he was sick, not a minor illness, not something he could simply pray away or push through, but something serious, something that had already forced him to his knees more times than he wanted to admit. He explained that the tightness in his chest, the dizziness, the collapse, they were not accidents or random episodes. They were warnings, warnings he ignored until his body forced him to listen. He said he didn't want people to worry, didn't want to appear weak, didn't want to be seen as anything less than the strong shepherd they expected. But holding everything inside had nearly cost him everything: his health, his peace, and his life. As he spoke, his voice shook, not from fear of judgment, but from the emotional weight of finally admitting his truth. He talked about the pressure of carrying an entire ministry, the impossible expectations placed on him, the fear of letting people down. He admitted he cried some nights, not because he lacked faith, but because he felt overwhelmed by the responsibility he shouldered alone. His honesty broke the room. Some people covered their mouths, others wiped tears. A few bowed their heads as if witnessing something too raw to stare at directly. Then came the most heartbreaking revelation, the tragic news he had kept hidden even from many close to him. He said the doctors had given him strict orders: slow down or risk not surviving the next collapse. He needed rest, treatment, and time away from the pulpit. And saying those words out loud was the hardest thing he had ever done, because for him, stepping back felt like failing the people he loved. But he finally understood that if he didn't protect his own life, he wouldn't be able to help anyone else. When he finished, there was no applause, no shouting, no music, just a deep, painful silence. A silence filled with respect, heartbreak, and a collective realization that even the strongest leaders bleed behind the scenes. His confession didn't make him weaker in their eyes. It made him real. It made him human. And for the first time in his ministry, he was not standing above his people, but standing among them, a man facing tragedy with honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to finally tell the world the truth. In the end, everything he had tried to hide finally came into the light. not to expose him, but to free him. The truth he carried alone for so long became the very thing that reminded everyone that even the strongest leaders are still human, still fragile, still in need of the grace they preach. His confession didn't weaken his legacy, it deepened it. It showed a man who had spent years pouring strength into others while quietly running empty himself. And as he stepped back, not in defeat but in humility, the world saw a different kind of courage. The courage to admit pain, the courage to rest, the courage to heal. His story now stands as a powerful reminder that no one was meant to carry life's weight alone, and for the first time in years, he walks into a new chapter, not as the pastor who held everything together, but as a man finally learning to let go and allow himself to be held.